July 1943, Eastern Front. Hitler initiates an unprecedented blitz tank war against Stalin's enormous Red Army. We were increasingly convinced that we would manage it. Two gigantic tanks clashed, armor against armor, in the greatest tank battle in history. It was as if two bulls had charged at each other. Defeat is not a solution. The entire future fate of World War II is at stake. In the depths of my soul, I knew one thing: whether I perish or not, I will not leave my post until complete victory. This is the bloodiest tank war, the Battle of Kursk. In the vast steppes of southern Russia stretches a murderous landscape near Prokhorovka. Where the epicenter of the greatest and bloodiest tank battle in history unfolds. In a single day, thousands of soldiers paid the highest price. All around, stretching to the horizon, fields of rye and wheat extend. It is precisely this landscape that in 1943 created the scene of the greatest and bloodiest tank battle in the history of tank warfare. Operation Citadel was Hitler's last risky offensive maneuver, intended to change the course of events on the Eastern Front. Since the beginning of 1943, when the unstoppable German advance was harshly halted, the Red Army had launched an offensive. They pushed the Germans back by 300 kilometers. Hitler's hopes for victory on the Eastern Front were evaporating. In the spring of that year, however, Germany was preparing a massive counter-offensive under the codename Operation Citadel. He planned to execute a maneuver in the form of large pincer movements, with which he intended to cut off a salient of Soviet territory, whose center was the industrial city of Kursk. The aim was to encircle and destroy more than 500,000 Soviet forces in the Kursk arc. For the first time, the attack was led by elite German units, Hitler's Praetorian Guard, and also the 3rd SS Division, infamously renowned as armored pirates, whose members were recruited directly by Hitler, and who on the Eastern Front became famous for their fearlessness and fanaticism. We were about 20 to 25 years old, and we were all loyal to Germany and believed in our homeland. For their attack, the Germans gathered 780,000 men, nearly 10,000 artillery pieces and 2,500 tanks. Hitler was convinced that the strength and speed of his tank division's attack must bring victory to the Germans. He postponed the launch of Operation Citadel by more than 3 months until he had his new secret weapon ready, the newly designed Panther tank. Previously, we only had Panther III and Panther IV tanks, but now there was also the Panther, which was faster, better maneuverable, and moreover had an excellent cannon. However, the postponement provided Stalin with the time he needed for preparations. His strategy was based on the most thorough defense possible. To confront the expected onslaught of tanks, he decided to face them with mines and anti-tank ditches, which were dug by thousands of workers. The aim was to absorb the individual waves of German attacks, deplete their strength, and thwart their blitzkrieg. In the depths of my soul, I knew one thing. Whether I perish or not, I will stay at my post until complete victory. And I focused on one thing: to kill as many Germans as possible. In order to withstand the impending German attack, the Soviets mobilized nearly 2 million men, 25,000 artillery pieces, and more than 5,000 tanks. The Soviet war machine had ramped up fully several days before the battle. What the T-34 tanks lacked in firepower compared to their newer German rivals, they compensated with overwhelming numbers. We really had so many of those tanks, so many. I adore it, really. That tank is amazing. The T-34 formed the backbone of the Soviet armored forces. With its 76mm main cannon and sloped frontal armor reaching a thickness of up to 48mm, the T-34 represented an ideal machine with a balanced ratio of firepower and protection. At the beginning of the summer of 1943, the Red Army deployed thousands of these tanks along the extensive Kursk arc, laid more than 400,000 mines, and dug over 4,000 kilometers of trenches. Finally, they were ready for the German attack, and at midnight on July 5th, it truly began. Suddenly, a completely fiery sea appeared all around. Constant gunfire and explosions. The noise was deafening, and we could barely recognize our surroundings. We were all afraid of death, that's clear. But it was important to overcome that fear. In the eastern sector, the German attacks were led by divisions of SS armored grenade units, whose task was to penetrate the Soviet defenses all the way to Kursk. The responsibility was to be secured by the 3rd Tank Battalion, whose goal was to establish a key bridgehead along the Donets River, so that firing would commence at dawn. Were infantry and engineers who had already crossed the river and suffered heavy losses. The German engineers built a bridge over the river, but the artillery of the Red Army was aimed directly at the crossing point. In the tank, it was enough for us to close the hatch, and we were safe. But the engineers were there with only steel helmets and a whistle in their mouths. The water in the river looked as if it were boiling during the artillery attack. The T-34 tanks, along with most of the other tanks, reached the other side and encountered further obstacles: mines. However, these were infantry mines that ricocheted off the tank's armor and did not cause significant damage. On the right flank, the Germans suffered considerable losses, but nothing could stop the SS division in the center. It managed to break through a gap in the Soviet defensive line, 1.20 kilometers wide and 16 kilometers deep. When the Totenkopf units reinforced us, we had no barrier left. We were good soldiers and knew that we would not stop for anything and that we would advance no matter what. On these wide steppes, the artillery and tanks of the Soviet army had to face a fierce onslaught of German Tigers. I was the commander of the 3rd Artillery Battery. In order to fight from our tanks, we had to create special anti-tank defensive positions aimed at the threatened areas. Of course, we had to constantly watch out for the Tigers. From my observation post, I spotted a Tiger in a prominent position on the field that was firing at our tanks. It took a stand and did not allow our tanks to approach it. They tried to get close from the right and from the left in order to knock it out of the air. The Tiger tank is the perfect German armored vehicle. It is equipped with 10-centimeter thick armor that is practically impenetrable. But the bloodiest weapon on our relentless steppes became the Tiger with its 88mm caliber cannon, which could hit targets over 2 kilometers away. For the Germans to have any chance, the T-34 tanks had to get within 300 to 400 meters, and also from the side. I had no idea what the situation was. Tanks of the Tiger type continued their seemingly unstoppable advance, and at stake was not only the city of Kursk, but also the fate of the entire motherland of Russia. This is what the city of Kursk looks like today, amid the vast Russian steppes. In 1943, it stood at the epicenter of a colossal armed clash, and the whole world held its breath as the fate of 2 great powers was being decided. In 1944, on July 5th, Hitler launched Operation Citadel. His elite tank divisions broke into the Soviet defenses and the Eastern Front erupted in one blaze. Hitler wanted the Soviets in the Kursk salient to charge into enormous pincers, and he launched 2 simultaneous attacks. His goal was to encircle and destroy the Red Army. In selected sectors, at the head of the German army stood SS divisions, which within several hours broke through Soviet defensive lines by 16 kilometers. The tank units of the Red Army, composed of T-34s, were ordered to move closer to the attacking units and form a defense of the rear line. Their task was to stop the onslaught of German tanks at any cost. The heavy detachments of T-34s had better cannons, so the Soviet units had to get as close as possible and hit them at their most vulnerable spot from the side. It was an extreme risk, because the T-34 could destroy enemies at a distance of just under 2 km.
Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Bryukov, the commander of a T-34 tank, was tasked with reaching the front lines as quickly as possible.
He was aiming from the north at them, along the Sel River and a natural moat that was meant to allow escape from the Tiger cannons. He rolled through one of these valleys, turned, approached the edge, and suddenly spotted a Tiger that was directly above him. I probably had mixed feelings, maybe a little fear, but I'm not sure. It happened so suddenly. That tank appeared right in front of me. At that moment, I thought of nothing else but how to get rid of it, how to destroy it so that it would not attack me. Bryukov was lucky. He was able to shoot one of its vulnerable spots, the lower part of the Tiger. Fired a deadly shot. As soon as he came down, I got him. I was lucky, but we were constantly afraid. One could not escape that fear. The Battle of Kursk raged for an entire week. Although the Tigers had better guns, the Soviets possessed what seemed like an inexhaustible number of T-34 tanks, and Hitler's master plan began to crack. The Tigers from the SS division continued their advance toward Kursk, but the deployment of Hitler's new weapon ended in catastrophe. The new Panther tanks were introduced into action too early, did not meet expectation, and disappointed across the entire front. In the operational field, they suffered many malfunctions, and at that moment only 10 out of 200 tanks were still in action, and the 3rd Tank Battalion was unable to reach the bridgehead in the Donetsk Valley. The right flank of the SS division was so dangerously exposed that, because it was supposed to continue advancing, it attempted to cunningly achieve what could not be obtained by brute force. It attempted a secret night maneuver directly from the Kursk Soviet defensive line. It was a very daring plan by Major Francis Bekras of the 6th Tank Division, who had a reputation as a fearless fighter. Bekras wanted to capture as much territory as possible so that we could achieve our goal. He told the others to wait until dawn, but he did not. That was the ideal time for an attack, and so it happened. He positioned 2 halted T-34 tanks at the front, so that their noise would mask the movement of other units. In accordance with the laws of war, they bore German Balkan crosses, but these were covered with blankets. I maintained radio silence and concentrated during the firing. And then we drove past the first barricade, formed by deadly anti-tank guns that did not fire at us. Bekras managed to deceive the Soviets by using the characteristic sound of the T-34 tank. A formation of 22 tanks is heading toward us. My column is being passed by almost with their tracks alongside ours. But then 6 or 7 tanks turned and joined behind us. I ordered my men to continue forward, and I turned my command tank, which had only a mock-up cannon, sideways to confuse the enemy tanks. He was a brave and truly good commander. We crawled out of the tank. Even the Russians did not see us. We crept over to our tanks, placed magnetic charges in 2 T-34s, and jumped into our vehicles.
The explosions lit up the night. Then we placed another 2 magnetic charges. The charges were set, and we began firing at the enemy. We were very successful there and eliminated the Russian units.
Beckeris's risk paid off. The SS division was no longer covered from the side and was heading forward to break through one of the last defensive lines near the village of Prokhorovka and continue toward Kursk. But the Germans had no idea that 500 tanks of the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army were in their way. And soon, the greatest battle of armored vehicles in history would take place.
These are the steppes in southern Russia. Today we have a gently cultivated landscape with wheat and rye fields. But in 1943 it transformed into a battlefield where there was no shelter for tanks. It is July 11th, 1943. The day of Operation Citadel. The SS Armored Grenade Division broke through a 48-kilometer-long gap in the Soviet defensive lines. And the climax of the Battle of Kursk, full of incredible violence, is approaching. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army is held in reserve about 100 kilometers behind the front lines. Fearing that the German advance might spoil everything, it is now rushing into action in the Kursk area and preparing a massive counter-offensive from the village of Prokhorovka, aimed at the rear flank of the German divisions. Practically at the same time, the SS divisions are also moving toward the village of Prokhorovka. Neither side had any idea what the other was doing, and thus, almost by chance, the scene was set for the decisive tank battle on the Eastern Front.
There is Prokhorovka. Do you see that small hill? It stands there like a silent witness to the entire tragedy that took place on these fields and in Prokhorovka. None of us could have imagined then that the small village of Prokhorovka, not far from the railway, would go down in history as the site of one of the greatest and most important tank battles of World War II.
In the evening of July 7th, from his command post in Prokhorovka, General Lieutenant Rotmistrov, commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, observed tank units in the distance. At first he thought that Soviet T-34s were approaching, but then he was surprised to discover that they were German tanks. The Soviets now had to change their plans and prepare for a head-on clash with the German SS divisions. We had very strong feelings because, according to the order of the Supreme General, we were to stay in place, fight to the end, and not relinquish Prokhorovka to the enemy. On July 12th, at dawn, the rumble of tank engines could be heard for miles because 300 German tanks and 500 Soviet T-34s were just being prepared for battle. Behind the railway embankment on the left flank of the Soviet army, Savely Ilyich was in charge of one of the Soviet anti-tank guns. At 8:30, he was one of the first to notice the advancing massive SS divisions.
The entire field at Prokhorovka was literally covered with moving tanks. We aimed at the lower parts of the tanks or as close as possible to their hulls. If the aiming cross of our sights appeared on one of these spots, the shell hit exactly where we wanted. Only thanks to accurate shooting were we able to fight from the tank. During that war, we learned very quickly. For example, we soon recognized whether light or heavy artillery units were firing at us, or if anti-tank guns were shooting. Every projectile had its specific sound. It was absolutely crucial to recognize who and from where they were shooting at us. The cumulative ammunition, in fact, contained a special substance that, upon impact with the armor, caused it to melt through.
The armor-piercing shells contained a high explosive charge and were meant to pierce armor 5 centimeters thick at a distance of 1 km, explode, and destroy the tank from the inside. These shells caused the tanks to catch fire and turn into enormous fireballs. When several of our tanks were hit, the men inside suffered terrible burns. The tank on my left was hit and emitted terrifying screams. Tanks that managed to get out had dreadful burns on the upper half of their hulls. It was horrifying. North of the railway embankment, in the center of the battlefield, in the first wave of the German attack on Prokhorovka, was also the tank commander Rudolf von Ribbentrop. When the Soviets made the unusual and rash decision to face the Germans head-on, the situation changed dramatically. What I saw literally took my breath away. Approximately 150-200 meters in front of me, a whole wave of tanks rushed up a gentle hill, very close together. It wasn't even possible to count how many there were. There was an unbelievable number, and they were advancing quickly. And suddenly, we faced them head-on. Neither did they expect us to be so fast there, nor were we prepared. The SS division took up a position in a tank wedge, with Tiger tanks in the center and lighter armored vehicles on the flanks. They planned to break through the enemy lines using their heavy armor. The Soviet T-34s, when exposed to direct threat, faced a deadly armor wedge. The Tigers, which had better cannons, could only hope to get as close to the enemy as possible and as quickly as possible. They probably expected the advance to be halted, but no. 2 enormous masses of tanks stood against each other, and everyone was initially a bit confused and stunned. And at that moment I thought, now or never. We stood face to face and began to kill each other. The battlefield turned into a chaotic mass of tanks firing at each other from very close range. For the tanks on both sides, it was a fight for survival. And so it began. We were shooting at each other practically at close range, 100, 200 meters. There was no need for any long-range cannons. We simply shot at close range. No one knew how the situation would develop. Neither the generals of the army, nor the generals of the artillery units, nor the brigade commanders. We were ready. We were young lads, and the order was an order, and it was attack. But we could not foresee how this battle would unfold. We were just mere infantry. Perhaps even the generals knew that. It was a true test of nerves, because even at that young age, my hair had grayed. I had completely turned gray. By noon, the entire battlefield was burning, and it had literally become hell. Fires were burning there. Cars, tanks, everything was engulfed in a single fiery flame. It was a terrible battle. Clouds of smoke rose upward, and it was dark, as if it were evening. Below, a war massacre was taking place, and from above, volleys of deadly bombs were falling. Everyone was dropping bombs there, us and the Germans. I don't think the Germans had specific targets, they were simply dropping bombs indiscriminately. A bloodshed was taking place on both sides. Death came from all directions, and the tanks were trapped in the middle of the battlefield. One fears death. No one wants to die. I still cannot understand how they hit my tank, whether it was a bomb or if I was struck by an early shell. Pavlov's T-34 tank was fully loaded with fuel and ammunition. Everything was flammable. That commander told his own commander that they would have to evacuate, but he did not answer. He was dead. My comrade, who sat next to me, opened the tank hatch even before me. Immediately after I got out, I heard an explosion. I still remember that moment vividly. Only 2 members of Pavlov's crew survived. The losses of tanks reached catastrophic proportions on both sides, and it was clear that the Soviet losses were greater. Nevertheless, the Soviet T-34s defended against the German advance as best as they could, even using the desperate tactic of direct charges, something that had never before occurred in the history of armored vehicles. It looked as if 2 bulls had charged at each other. In his final risky move in an attempt to achieve victory on the Eastern Front, Hitler was heading toward his bloody climax on the fields near the village of Prokhorovka. "300 tanks of the German SS armored grenade divisions clashed with 500 tanks of the Soviet army, loaded on a field covering approximately 5 to 7 kilometers. Armored fighting vehicles had never before been gathered in such numbers. A desperate fight for life and death was taking place here. The elite tank units of the SS were prepared for the bloodiest battle but no one had ever seen so much war machinery together, and the massacre that was about to unfold could not be adequately prepared for. The Soviets received orders to exploit the speed and maneuverability of the T-34 and charged directly at the German tanks. It looked as if two bulls had charged at each other. With this voluntary ramming, both the German and the Soviet tank were damaged. At the same time, the feared 88mm cannon of the Tigers was taken out of action. The Germans had never seen anything like it before. This was the first time the Red Army used this tactic. There were only a few hours left until night. Whoever wins this battle will also capture Kursk. The German tanks in this bloody battle felt that victory was within their grasp.
We were increasingly convinced that we would manage it. I want to tell you that we were not afraid. That is why we attacked and attacked. The SS divisions relentlessly engaged in assault battles. The Soviet tank divisions were pushed almost to the edge of Prokhorovka, and the soldiers began to panic. And we said to ourselves that the lines were broken. The units had disintegrated. The army was being pushed back. But we were here to support the Fifth Army. The generals of the Red Army, however, did not give up. They sent more and more T-34 tanks into battle. It didn't matter how many the Germans destroyed. New ones kept appearing in their place. Rudolf von Ribbentrop was amazed by the perseverance and number of Soviet T-34s. If we had stood still at that moment, the Russian tanks would have destroyed us. 30 meters to our right stood a Russian T-34. I saw how the tank slightly tilted on its chassis and turned its gun turret toward us. Suddenly, I was looking straight into the mouth of its cannon. I shouted into the microphone, "Step on it!" And my driver had already engaged full speed. We drove after that T-34. The Russians tried to rotate the gun turret behind us, but they failed. We stopped about 10 meters behind the stationary T-34 and turned our cannon. My gunner hit the turret directly. The T-34 exploded. Its turret flew off about 3 meters and nearly hit the cannon of my tank. During this action, other T-34s drove past us. At the end of the day, after 11 hours of this slaughter, neither side managed to achieve a decisive success. The Germans and Soviets remained where they were. The battlefield was controlled by no one, and Prokhorovka was literally strewn with burning tanks. The battlefield looked like a heap of shattered equipment. Across the entire field, in ravines and at the edges of the forest, hundreds of destroyed German and Soviet tanks lay. At Kursk, the German blitzkrieg on the Eastern Front met a hard stop. In the face of the relentless Soviet resistance, Hitler's planned pincer movements never reached their goal. Kursk itself remained completely untouched, and the sounds of battle were heard everywhere. The losses on both sides were enormous. In Operation Citadel, 80,000 men died and 3,000 tanks were destroyed. The Soviet forces managed to hold back the Germans. The Red Army will remember this as its great victory. The day after the Battle of Prokhorovka,
Hitler withdrew his forces after learning of the Allied invasion of southern Italy and had to now concentrate on a two-front war. The Battle of Kursk ended, and for the Germans, it meant a huge and irreparable failure. From these fields of Prokhorovka, the German units began to retreat, and within 2 years they found themselves back in front of Berlin.
Our combat morale was truly shaken by it. What? We are retreating? That simply does not happen to us. We had never experienced such a defeat before. In just one day on these murderous fields of Prokhorovka, death claimed the lives of thousands of soldiers. For many, this place became a sacred memorial site to the heroism of the tank crews of the Red Army who saved their motherland. Historians are right when they call this battle one of the greatest that decided the fate of the entire Second World War. The fate of this war was sealed after the Battle of Kursk. It was truly a turning point for the Red Army. I remember my comrades who perished here. I will forever remember them, always think of them. Friends, rest in peace.